I arrived at Evan and Brielle's house that night with a pie in my hands and a knot tightening in my stomach, though I couldn't explain why at the time. The windows glowed with warm light, the kind a camera crew might use to make a room look inviting, and I told myself not to read into the feeling creeping up my spine. I was 62, not ancient, not fragile, not confused. I could walk into my son's home without bracing for impact. At least that's what I kept telling myself as I stepped inside and heard laughter swell like a wave cresting before it breaks. Brielle glided toward me in a champagne-colored dress that shimmered under the pendant lights. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Her smile stretched wide enough to show every tooth she'd paid to have whitened. She took the pie with the kind of polite, brittle enthusiasm people reserve for gifts they didn't want. "You made it, Marjorie," she said brightly. "Good. I wasn't sure you'd remember the time." A few guests tittered nearby, mistaking her jab for humor. I tried to smile, even as heat rose to my cheeks. Brielle looped her arm through mine and lowered her voice, her breath brushing my ear. "You old people should learn to live less comfortably," she whispered. "Luxury is wasted on your generation." Then she pulled away, lifting her champagne flute and laughing at something no one had said. I stood frozen, feeling the words burrow beneath my ribs. Across the table, a woman I didn't recognize watched me with a look that wasn't curiosity. It was warning. And for a moment, I wondered what exactly she knew. I steadied myself and followed the sounds of conversation, trying not to crumble under the casual cruelty Brielle had delivered with a smile. I'd been insulted before by strangers, by coworkers years ago, by people with less kindness than sense, but never by family. Never by someone who claimed to love my son. As I moved through the dining room, it became clear this wasn't a dinner. It was a stage production. Brielle orchestrated every detail: where people sat when drinks were refreshed, which jokes were amplified. She wanted eyes on her admiration, orbiting her like planets around a sun. And she wanted me placed exactly where she could manage me out of the way, near the end of the table beside a guest who seemed more interested in texting than acknowledging my existence. When I tried to participate in the conversation about travel, Brielle redirected it to something trivial about skincare. When I laughed at another guest's story, she cut in with a gentle pat on my hand and said, "Don't strain yourself, Marjorie. These debates can get lively." Her tone made me feel like an object everyone politely tolerated. Then came the moment that snapped something inside me. A man seated 2 chairs over complimented her home decor, and Brielle, never missing an opportunity, chimed in. "Evan works so hard to cover everything. Supporting 2 households isn't easy, but he manages." 2 households. I blinked at the implication. My son didn't support me financially, never had. I'd been independent my entire adult life, through Jonathan's illness, through widowhood, through every season of hardship and strength. But her words floated across the room, planting a seed in the minds of people who didn't know better. The woman at the far end of the table, the one who had given me that unsettling look earlier, shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing with recognition. She wasn't fooled by Brielle's performance. After dessert, many of the guests drifted into the living room, wine glasses in hand. I gathered my jacket from the back of a chair, eager to leave, before Brielle found another opportunity to diminish me. As I slipped my arm into the sleeve, I felt something crinkle in the pocket. A folded $20 bill. Brielle's voice floated to me from behind. "Just in case you forgot your wallet again," she said lightly. "Older folks shouldn't worry about little emergencies." I began, stunned, but she was already turning away, her laughter merging with the others. I stood absolutely still for several seconds, absorbing the humiliation, one sharp breath at a time. I had never forgotten my wallet. I had never asked her for help, not financially, not emotionally, not in any sense whatsoever. She was creating a narrative, sculpting a version of me that suited her needs, frail, forgetful, dependent. But why? When I stepped outside, the cold air wrapped around me like a welcome embrace, clearing my thoughts. I walked slowly to my car, each footstep steadying me. I refused to sit behind the wheel until my hands stopped trembling. Eventually, I exhaled and pressed the ignition button. Then my phone buzzed. A bank notification illuminated the dark interior of the car. Thank you for confirming your recurring payments. Recurring payments, I hadn't changed anything. I hadn't confirmed anything. I tapped the alert, but the screen displayed only a generic message: your automated payment update was successful. Successful. Before I could think, another notification appeared. Your scheduled payment has been modified. What payment? I scrolled through my recent transactions, but none of the updates were visible yet. It was as if someone had made changes moments before. A chill settled across my shoulders. Someone had access to my account. I sat there staring at the glowing screen, the laughter from inside the house muffled behind closed doors, feeling the edges of a truth I wasn't ready to face. Something wasn't right. Something had been wrong for longer than I'd wanted to admit. As I drove away, my headlights cut through the quiet street, illuminating the trimmed hedges and polished sidewalks of Evan's neighborhood. I replayed the night's events in my mind. Brielle's whisper, the woman's sympathetic gaze, the folded bill, the bank alerts, all forming a pattern I hadn't seen until now. When I reached home, I placed my jacket over the back of a chair and sat at the kitchen table. The familiar hum of the refrigerator was comforting, steady, constant. I opened my laptop, pressed in my password, and navigated to my bank's transaction history. I expected to find a mistake or glitch, something explainable. What I saw instead made my breath catch in my throat. There weren't one or two unusual payments. There were dozens. Recurring charges I didn't recognize. Merchants I had never done business with. Transactions dating back months, maybe longer. Rows upon rows of money quietly siphoned away from me. My hand hovered over the trackpad as I scrolled each new entry, tightening the knot in my stomach. I leaned closer, reading the descriptions: beauty memberships, club fees, wellness packages, tutoring programs, meal deliveries. I searched for a connection, a pattern. And then I found it. Each payment, every last one of them, had been authorized under family member access. My heart thudded against my ribs. Family member. My gaze dropped to the bottom of the page where an option appeared in faint gray text. See more linked authorizations. I clicked, and the screen overflowed with a list far longer than I ever imagined. That was the moment I understood Brielle's cruelty wasn't petty, wasn't impulsive, wasn't limited to whispers over champagne. It was built on something far deeper, something deliberate, and I had just uncovered the first layer. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the endless list of unfamiliar transactions scrolling behind my eyelids, like they were burned into the back of my mind. By morning, exhaustion sat heavily on my shoulders, but a sharper feeling had settled beneath it, something cold, pointed, and impossible to ignore. Fear, yes, but something else too. Defiance. I made coffee, sat at the dining table with my laptop, and forced myself to open the bank portal again. Maybe the night had distorted things. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe I was overreacting. But the numbers didn't lie. They lined up in neat, merciless rows across my screen, each one mocking me with its false legitimacy. Charges I never authorized. Services I never used. Merchants I didn't recognize. I scrolled and scrolled, hoping the pattern would stop somewhere. It didn't. My cursor hovered over a category labeled Household Support, authorized by family member. Family member. The words left a metallic taste in my mouth. I clicked it and felt my throat tighten as the list expanded into a longer chain of transactions. Someone had been draining me with surgical precision. The sun hadn't risen past the fence yet, but I couldn't sit there any longer. I grabbed my phone and called Tessa, the only person I could think of who might help me make sense of this. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and warm, so at odds with the storm gathering in my chest. Aunt Marjorie. Everything okay? I need your eyes on something, I said, surprised by how fragile my voice sounded. Are you free at lunch? For you always? Her certainty steadied me more than the coffee had. By noon, she was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, hair pulled into a neat bun, glasses perched on the end of her nose. She reminded me so much of her mother, meticulous, fast-thinking, and tender-hearted, that my chest ached for a moment. Losing her mother had cut me in ways grief still hadn't healed, but seeing Tessa there ready to help felt like getting back a small piece of what I'd lost. "Show me everything," she said, fingers poised above the keys. I slid the laptop toward her. She scanned the screen, frowning as she clicked through transaction histories, sorting them by date merchant category. It didn't take long for her expression to shift from puzzled to disturbed. "Aunt Marjorie," she murmured, "this isn't random. Someone built a structure here." She leaned closer, narrowing her eyes. "This is systematic." I felt my stomach drop. "Systematic," she nodded. "These accounts, these vendors, they're all connected in some way. This isn't the work of someone making a few irresponsible purchases. This is someone using your identity to support an entire lifestyle." A tremor traveled through my hands. "How many payments?" She clicked a few more times, filtered a list, and then quietly whispered, 112. I exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table. 112. The number sounded unreal. Impossible. She printed the summary, and we spread the pages across the table like a crime scene. Beauty treatment memberships, premium meal subscriptions, luxury club fees, monthly tutoring for a child I didn't know, transportation services in cities I had never visited, wellness packages, spa programs, home deliveries of expensive supplements. My life wasn't reflected anywhere in those records. But Brielle's, her curated luxury, her flawless image, oh yes. I saw her in every line item. Tessa tapped one particular row with her pen. "This one here," she said. "Recurring payments to a P.O. box. It varies every month." "That's odd. I've never had a P.O. box," I murmured. "Exactly." She wrote the number down to trace later. I watched her work, her brow furrowed in a way that reminded me of her mother deciphering puzzles. Every so often she paused, her expression darkening as she uncovered another connection, another payment trail that didn't belong. And then she froze. "Aunt Marjorie," she said slowly, "someone logged into your bank profile from 2 different IP addresses recently. One is consistent with Evan and Brielle's home network." My breath caught, and the other... She hesitated. "It's masked. That means someone knows how to hide their digital footprint. Someone who doesn't want to be found." A cold ripple ran along my spine. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. Evan's name flashed on the screen. My heart stuttered. "I should answer," I said, though my hand shook as I picked up. "Mom," his voice was thin, tense. Did Brielle say anything strange to you last night?" The memory of her whisper made my pulse quicken. "What makes you ask?" He paused too long, breathing unevenly. "She was upset this morning. I thought maybe something happened. Something happened, but I didn't know if telling him now was wise." "Evan," I said carefully, "have you been accessing my financial accounts?" Silence. Heavy, stretching, painful. Then he whispered, "I'll look into it. I'll call you later." But there was fear in his voice. Not fear of me. Fear of someone near him. When the call ended, I stared at the silent phone, unable to shake the hollow ache settling inside me. I had raised that boy with love so clean and steady, it felt like truth carved into bone. I couldn't imagine him hurting me. But I also couldn't deny the tension in his voice, or the warning I thought I'd seen in his eyes last night. I sat back down beside Tessa, clinging to the strength of her presence. "Aunt Marjorie," she said gently, her eyes searching mine, "I think this is bigger than just Brielle. Bigger." The word felt too large, too heavy. She slid another printed sheet toward me. Look at the timeline, she said. These payments spike when you were hospitalized after Jonathan passed. Whoever did this wasn't just opportunistic. They waited until you were vulnerable. My breath wavered. You're saying this started when I was grieving? Tessa squeezed my hand. People take advantage of seniors in grief. It's one of the most common forms of exploitation. I swallowed hard. I never thought it would happen to me. None of us ever do. Her voice softened. But you're not alone, and now we know. I stared at the pages on my table, the evidence of months, maybe years of manipulation. My hands trembled, but beneath the trembling was something firmer. The same grit Jonathan used to admire. The same resolve he used when he fought through his long illness. I would not go quietly into the vulnerability someone crafted for me. Tessa continued tracing lines with her pen, circling entries that matched earlier anomalies. At one point she paused, eyes narrowing as if seeing something emerging beneath the surface. Look, she whispered. These transactions, these specific charges line up perfectly with the ones your husband logged in his ledger before he passed. My heart stilled. You think Jonathan saw this beginning? I asked. I think he suspected more than he ever told you. I leaned back, the room suddenly tilting. For a moment, grief washed over me, raw and sharp, remembering Jonathan's hands shaking as he tried to tell me something important in those last months. But I'd been too consumed with caring for him to listen. Or perhaps he'd tried to protect me from something he feared. Then Tessa looked up, the color drained from her face. "Aunt Marjorie," she murmured. "This login here, it's from a device using a family role identifier. Someone tied their access to your profile as though they were your legal caretaker." Caretaker? The word struck like ice. "I don't have a caretaker," I whispered. "I know," she said softly. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling like dust after an explosion. Then Tessa touched my arm gently. "There's something else," she said. "I found a second bank profile linked to your social security number. But you never set it up, and it's restricted behind a password you didn't create." I stared at her, pulse thundering. "A second profile?" She nodded. "Someone has built an entire financial shadow of your identity." My breath shook. She took both my hands in hers and said quietly, "Aunt Marjorie, Brielle is not working alone." Her words lingered in the air, folding into the quiet of the house, wrapping around my ribs like a tightening band. Somewhere beyond my own fear, beyond my humiliation, something colder rose, determination. Because whoever had done this, whoever thought they could strip me of dignity, autonomy, and truth, they were about to learn who I really was. And I wouldn't be alone. I don't know what I expected when I drove to Oliver Grant's office the next morning. Maybe clarity, maybe confirmation that the storm Tessa and I uncovered had some logical explanation. Instead, I found myself sitting across from a man who had known me for nearly 30 years and yet suddenly couldn't look me in the eye. Oliver stood as I entered, smoothing his tie with nervous fingers. He'd aged since Jonathan passed. His hair was thinner, his gait slower, but his voice still carried the steady professional warmth I had always trusted. "Marjorie," he said, extending a hand, "it's good to see you. Please sit." He gestured to a leather chair across from his mahogany desk, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I sat folding my hands in my lap to hide the faint tremor in them. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." "For you always," he said quickly, almost too quickly. He settled behind his desk, and for a moment we sat in a strange silence that felt nothing like the comfortable quiet we used to share with Jonathan during tax meetings or estate planning sessions. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You sounded troubled on the phone." "I am," I said, "and I need you to be honest with me." He nodded, but something tightened in his expression. I placed the printed records from my bank account on his desk. "Oliver, what do you know about these transactions?" He skimmed a few lines, his brows knitting. "Well, these appear to be recurring charges, subscriptions, memberships." "I didn't authorize them," I said sharply. He froze. I didn't approve a single payment. Not one. I leaned forward. Someone linked themselves to my account. Someone posing as a caretaker. Someone using my social security number. He set down the papers slowly, carefully, like they were something explosive. I came to you, I continued, because you've managed my financial records for decades, and because I trust you. He flinched. That flinch unsettled me more than any bank alert. Marjorie, he began gently, identity theft among seniors is far more common than people realize. It could be a scammer or a third-party merchant, or... It's not a scammer, I said. We traced the IP addresses. One came from Evan's home network. Oliver's mouth fell slightly open. From Evans? That's impossible. I thought so too. My voice wavered. I don't believe my son is behind this. But someone near him is. He swallowed hard. And here's the part I can't ignore, I said softly. These payments began after Jonathan died. The room darkened, not literally, but emotionally, as if the air thickened with unspoken things. Oliver reached into a drawer and pulled out a file, thin-worn and far too familiar. Jonathan's file. He placed it on the desk, sliding it slowly toward me. There's something I haven't told you. Something I should have told you months ago. The world seemed to tilt, but I kept my eyes steady on him. I knew he said quietly that someone was accessing your accounts. My pulse stilled. He continued. I noticed unusual activity shortly after Jonathan's funeral. Small charges at first, recurring patterns, services for 2 households being paid from one account. I thought perhaps you'd offered to help Evan and Brielle during a difficult time. I did not, I said through clenched teeth. He nodded. I know that now. I should have known it then. Why didn't you tell me? He sank back in his chair, a weary man finally surrendering. Because I was grieving too. Because I thought I was imagining things. Because I didn't want to question your family when you were vulnerable. Vulnerable. The word made my jaw tighten. And he added quietly, Jonathan left instructions. I felt a small, sharp twist in my chest. What kind of instructions? He hesitated before answering. He asked me not to overwhelm you with financial details immediately after his death. He said you would need time before taking on any additional stress. That doesn't explain why you didn't tell me 6 months later. Or a year later. No, he said, shame flooding his face. It doesn't. He opened Jonathan's file and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. My husband's handwriting covered it steady, firm, deliberate. I wasn't supposed to show you this until the 1-year mark after his passing, Oliver said. But I think the circumstances justify breaking that promise. Hands trembling, I unfolded the letter. Marjorie, if you're reading this, it means you've begun asking questions. It also means I didn't prepare you as well as I wanted to. Someone has been watching our finances. Someone close. I suspected it for months, maybe longer, but I never wanted to burden you. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well. My breath hitched. Someone close. Jonathan had known. He had sensed something slipping beneath the surface of our lives and tried to shield me. I looked up at Oliver. Did Jonathan know who was behind it? I don't think so, he said. But he suspected a pattern. He told me once Oliver hesitated, then continued that someone was circling our family. That someone wanted access to your stability. My stability. Not our assets, not our savings. Me. I swallowed a wave of nausea. Are you saying this started before Jonathan passed? Oliver nodded, based on timestamps, yes. A cold pulse moved through me. But how would anyone get that close? How would they know enough to mimic my identity? His silence was answer enough. You think it's someone inside the family? I whispered. I don't know what I think, he said, but whoever did this understands you well enough to exploit your routines, your grief, your trust. Trust. It tasted bitter on my tongue. Before I could continue, Oliver's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face changed completely, fear flashing across his features like lightning. He turned the screen toward me. A new charge. A massive one. Withdrawn from an account I didn't recognize. A second bank profile, the one Tessa had found. The payment description read Estate Wellness Program, Tier 3 enrollment, authorized by Family Guardian, I whispered. I don't have a guardian. Oliver's voice cracked. Marjorie, someone is preparing documents as if you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs. My pulse roared in my ears. Who would? Before I could finish, a voice echoed from the office doorway. Mom. Evan stood there, pale, breathless, holding his keys and shaking hands. How did you? Oliver stammered. I stopped by the house, Evan said, eyes fixed on me. Your car was gone. Then Brielle called and... His voice faltered. She said you were becoming paranoid. She said you were accusing her of financial abuse. His eyes, my sweet boy's eyes, were wide, stricken, confused. I rose slowly. Evan, did you authorize any payments from my account? No, he said, sounding horrified. I swear, Mom, I swear. I've never touched your finances. Brielle sometimes handles online bills, but I thought they were ours, not yours. A tremor spread across my shoulders. Then why, I said quietly, has my identity been tied to a wellness program that requires guardian consent? His mouth opened, but no words came. I stepped closer. Evan, did you sign anything on my behalf? His voice cracked. Mom, I don't know. I stared at him, stunned, but before I could speak, he added in a whisper so broken I barely heard him. I think Brielle made me sign something. I didn't understand what it was. She said it was routine paperwork. She said it was for life insurance for emergencies. I didn't read it. Oliver rose abruptly. Evan, did the document have the phrase durable authority on it? Evan's face drained of color. Yes, that sounds right. My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the desk. Durable authority. Power of attorney. Brielle had it. She'd forged the path piece by piece. A signature here, a login there, a whisper of incompetence, all woven into a trap so quiet I never heard it closing. Evan stepped toward me, eyes shining with panic. Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Tears stung my eyes, but not from betrayal, from the dawning realization that my son was as much a victim as I was. Evan, I whispered, tell me everything. He sat heavily in the chair across from me, rubbing his face with trembling hands. I thought she was helping, he said. She told me you were struggling, forgetful, distracted. She convinced me she was protecting you. She said signing the paperwork was just a precaution in case something happened to you. His voice broke. I didn't know she was doing this. I reached across the desk and took his hand. He clung to it like a drowning man. We're going to fix this, I said. Together. Oliver placed a folder between us, a plan taking shape in his expression. First, he said, we gather every piece of evidence, every login, every authorization, every forged consent. He looked at me with something fierce in his eyes. And then he said, we stop whoever is trying to take your life out from under you. I sat up straighter. Someone thought I was alone. Someone thought grief had hollowed me enough to slip into the cracks unnoticed. Someone thought they could treat me like I was disappearing. They were wrong. Because in that moment, hand in hand with my son Jonathan's warning echoing in my mind, and the truth laid out like a map across Oliver's desk, I felt something return to me. Strength, resolve, and a certainty that whoever had orchestrated this would soon wish they had never underestimated me. Not now. Not ever. I left Oliver's office with a folder of documents pressed against my chest, and Evan walking beside me, like a man half collapsed under the weight of something he could no longer carry. The winter air bit at our faces as we stepped into the parking lot, pale sunlight reflecting off the hoods of cars. I unlocked mine, but Evan didn't move toward his. He just stood there, staring at the asphalt, jaw tight. "I should have known," he murmured. "I should have seen something, anything." "You trusted your wife," I said. "That's not a crime. It feels like one," he whispered. I touched his arm gently. "Evan, we will get through this. But right now, I need you to be steady. Can you do that?" He nodded once, a small pained movement, and then walked to his car with the slowness of someone learning to breathe again. I watched him drive off, wondering if he had truly told me everything, or if there were wounds he hadn't yet found the words for. I drove home with the radio off the world too loud already. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a figure standing near the fence, short, bundled in a thick coat, leaning lightly on a cane. "Mrs. Drake." She turned as I stepped out, raising a gloved hand. "Marjorie, do you have a minute?" Something in her tone, gentle but urgent, told me she hadn't come for casual conversation. "Of course," I said, walking toward her. She looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to emerge from behind the hedges. I didn't want to interrupt, but "I've been meaning to speak with you." "Has something happened?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I saw someone near your mailbox the other morning. Tall man, hooded jacket. Not your son." My pulse skipped. "What was he doing? Taking something?" She whispered. "At first I thought he was just delivering a package, but he removed mail. Didn't put anything in." A cold ripple passed through me. "Did you recognize him?" "I couldn't see his face," she said. But when he noticed I was watching, he hurried to a black SUV parked down the street. It didn't have a neighborhood sticker. She paused, breath frosting in the air. I called out to him, but he drove off. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. "Did you manage to get a picture? Anything?" She nodded and pulled out her phone. A blurry one, but the plates are visible. My heart thudded as she handed me the screen. "Thank you," I whispered. "This means more than you know." She placed a warm hand over mine. We older women have to look out for each other. People think we're easy targets, but they forget we've lived long enough to see patterns others miss. We shared a knowing look. A quiet alliance formed right there in the crisp afternoon air. After she left, I brought her photo inside, printed it, and tucked it into the folder from Oliver. Then, still trembling from the conversation, I sat at my computer and opened the bank reports Tessa had compiled. The list of 112 automatic payments stared back at me. A full page of charges marked with small green checks, active, authorized, verified. Every one of them a reminder of how long someone had been siphoning my life away. My cursor hovered over the column labeled Updated By. Most rows read Family Member Access, but some, specifically the newest charges, listed an abbreviation I didn't recognize. FGA. I clicked the Info tab. It expanded. Financial Guardian Authorization. My breath hitched. Someone had legally positioned themselves as my guardian in the system, without my knowledge, without consent, without any valid court order. The sense of violation burrowed into me. Family guardian. The phrase made my skin crawl. No one had the right to claim guardianship over me. No one. As I stared at the screen, something else caught my eye, an alert in the corner I hadn't noticed before. A blinking message. Your card, ending in 1432, has been used at Northridge Wellness Center. Northridge. The name struck me like a physical blow. Jonathan's clinic. The place where he spent his final months. Where he had insisted everything was fine, even when I sensed something was wrong. Where paperwork went missing. Where every answer felt rehearsed. I sat back, heart pounding. Why would charges from that clinic be tied to my account now? Why would someone re-engage with a facility connected to my husband's decline? My fingers shook as I clicked deeper into the transactions. More charges appeared, 3 months' worth, all small but consistent, like someone testing the waters. Someone using my money to reopen a connection to a place that had once made my skin crawl. A knock startled me. I froze. Another knock, soft, polite, familiar. I stood and opened the door. Tessa stood there, cheeks pink from the cold, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. "Aunt Marjorie," she said breathlessly. "I found something else." She stepped inside, and I could feel her urgency in the way she moved, direct, purposeful. "What is it?" I asked. She set her laptop on the table, opened it, and pulled up a document. I traced the masked IP address from earlier. My pulse quickened, and it was rerouted through a clinic-owned server. She turned the screen toward me. Northridge Wellness Center. A chill deepened inside me. Why would a clinic access my financial profile? "That's the part that doesn't make sense," she said, "unless someone there filed paperwork connecting you to medical oversight." I gripped the back of my chair. But I haven't seen a doctor from there. I haven't stepped foot in that building since Jonathan. My throat closed, unable to finish. Tessa softened. "I know." She squeezed my hand, gently grounding me. "There's more," she said reluctantly. "I found a shared user ID connected to your secondary bank profile. It's registered under a name I don't recognize, Calvin Rudd." The name meant nothing to me. "Who is that? I don't know," she said. "But he's tied to several elder financial exploitation cases." My heart thudded. Exploitation. "He's never been formally charged," she added carefully. "But he's been linked to complaints from families where elderly clients lost assets under suspicious circumstances." I felt the blood drain from my face. A stranger. A stranger with access to my accounts. A stranger with a history of targeting seniors. Tessa inhaled slowly. "I think Brielle is just one part of this, Aunt Marjorie. I think someone bigger is pulling strings behind her." I didn't want to believe it. But the pieces were lining up too neatly, too intentionally. I steadied myself. "What do we do?" "For now," she said, "you need physical proof that someone outside the family is interfering. We have digital proof, but it won't be enough if this becomes a legal battle." A legal battle. The words felt heavy, real, and terrifying. Before I could respond, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small object. "Aunt Marjorie," she said, placing it in my palm. "This is a personal security recorder. It looks like a brooch. Wear it anytime you're around Brielle, or anyone connected to this." I stared at the tiny pin, silver, delicate, shaped like a leaf. It looked harmless, almost pretty. "You think I'll need this?" I asked quietly. "I think," she said, meeting my gaze, "that there's more going on than we can see. And if Brielle, or whoever she's working with, is preparing to declare you incompetent, you need your own evidence. You need your voice." Those words sank into me like roots anchoring into soil. My voice. My proof. My defense. I clipped the recording pin to my sweater just below my collarbone and exhaled slowly. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest flicker of something familiar. Something I hadn't felt since Jonathan's last good month, when he squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're stronger than you think." Strength. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, determined, resilient. Tessa closed her laptop. "I'll keep digging. You rest." But I knew I wouldn't rest, not until I understood everything. After she left, I walked through my house, touching the things Jonathan and I had built together. The framed photos, the wooden banister, the kitchen counter we sanded ourselves. This home was my history, my sanctuary. I would not let someone steal the life I had left. Not my freedom, not my dignity, not my autonomy. As evening fell, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, the brooch recorder warm against my sweater. A car slowed in front of my house, its headlights lingering a moment too long before pulling away. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't look away until it disappeared around the corner. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting. but so was I. And I was no longer afraid. I woke the next morning to the sharp trill of my phone vibrating across the nightstand. I blinked at the ceiling, heart pounding as though I'd been startled awake from a nightmare. When I checked the screen, I saw a number I didn't recognize, local, but unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. My life had become a collection of unwelcome surprises, and I wasn't sure I wanted another. But something nudged me, a quiet instinct. I trusted more and more these days. I answered. "Mrs. Hale," a voice said, male, smooth, formal. "My name is Calvin Rudd. I'm calling to follow up regarding your recent enrollment with Northridge Wellness." My stomach tightened, as if someone had reached inside and twisted. "I didn't enroll in anything," I said sharply. "And I don't know who you are." A soft chuckle. "I assure you I'm merely your assigned advisor. It's my job to walk you through the next steps of your wellness plan. Financial assessments, cognitive screenings, guardianship recommendations." Guardianship. The word punched the air from my lungs. "I did not authorize any screenings," I said. "And I don't have a guardian." "Well," he replied with a tone that felt almost amused, "that's the part we're here to clarify." My grip on the phone tightened. "Who enrolled me, I'm afraid. Confidentiality policies prevent me from disclosing that. On an unsecured line," he said, breezily. "However, your file indicates you have a designated family guardian. We simply need to confirm your readiness for assessment." "I will not be confirming anything with you," I snapped. There was a low hum on his end of the line, thinking, calculating. "Mrs. Hale, I'd like to offer you some advice," he said. "Fighting a guardianship recommendation can be complicated, especially when your medical records support a need for oversight." "My medical records are fine." "Are they?" he asked softly. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I ended the call. I sat there for several seconds, staring at the phone in my trembling hands. My mind raced in spirals. Who was he? What did he have access to? What had Brielle told him? And how much of my life had already been rewritten behind my back? I swallowed hard, grabbed my robe, and walked to the kitchen where the morning light was beginning to seep across the floorboards. I set the phone on the counter, turned on the kettle, and tried to steady my breathing. Tried. But the moment I lifted the mug to my lips, I heard a soft ding. A new email notification glowed on my laptop screen. I opened it and froze. Northridge Wellness Center. Subject confirmed appointment. Cognitive evaluation date, next Thursday. Time, 10:00 a.m. Location, Suite 4B. A single line beneath it. Your guardian has approved this appointment. My heart thudded like a fist against my ribs. They were moving quickly, too quickly, and I still didn't know how deep their intrusion went. I paced the kitchen until the kettle screeched, steam filling the air like a warning. I had to see what had been filed under my name. I needed a record proof of what they were trying to build. I pulled up Northridge's online portal and attempted to log in using a forgotten account from Jonathan's treatment days. The password still worked. I was directed to a page titled Patient Overview. There it was. My name, my date of birth, my insurance information, and then a tab I had never seen before, Cognitive Risk Factors. My hand shook as I clicked it. The page expanded into a series of notes and summaries, fabricated notes with timestamps matching days I'd never visited the clinic. Patient displays mild confusion in daily tasks. Concerns raised regarding memory lapse during conversation with family. Reports of disorientation while driving. Every line felt like a blade. Someone had created a medical record portraying me as incompetent. Jonathan's fear echoed in my mind, the way he had spoken in those final months. "We have to be careful, Marjorie. Someone's watching our accounts." At the time, I thought it was grief talking. Now I wasn't sure anymore. I printed everything, every note, every entry, every signature, and placed the papers into the folder I'd started assembling on my dining table. The pile was growing, becoming a physical embodiment of a threat I could finally see. A knock startled me. I stiffened instinctively, touching the brooch recorder pinned to my sweater. The sun had barely risen, too early for a delivery. Too early for a friendly neighbor. I approached the door quietly and looked through the peephole. It was Brielle. Her perfect hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail. Her makeup was already flawless, like she had rehearsed for whatever performance she was about to give. I opened the door only halfway. "Marjorie," she said sweetly. "There you are. I was worried when you didn't answer Evan's call." "I spoke to Evan yesterday," I replied. "He didn't call this morning." Her smile flickered, not in surprise, but in annoyance. She had expected me to say something else, something she could redirect. "May I come in?" she asked. "No," she blinked. "No, no," I repeated firmer. "Say what you need to say." She stood straighter, adjusting her coat. "Well, Evan and I talked last night, and we think it's best to move forward with some formal support for you." I stared at her. "Formal support?" She tilted her head like she was explaining arithmetic to a child. "A guardianship arrangement, Marjorie. Just temporary, until things stabilize." My pulse hammered. "You've been forgetful," she continued. "Erratic. And your reaction at dinner." "You humiliated me at dinner," I said. "That wasn't confusion. That was cruelty." Her expression froze, then reset into something smoother. "You misinterpreted what I said." "No," I said quietly. "I didn't." She sighed dramatically. "Look, I'm trying to help. You're struggling with finances. I'm not the one struggling with finances." Her eyes hardened. For a moment she slipped, just a moment, but it was enough. "I know about the automatic payments," I said, "all 112 of them." Her face went still. "And the secondary bank profile I added? And the clinic charges? And the IP logs? And the forged guardian approval?" The mask cracked. "You don't understand what you're stepping into," she whispered sharply. "You have no idea how deep this goes." "I know enough," I said. A muscle twitched in her jaw. "Calvin told you, didn't he?" The name hit the air like a dropped glass, so she did know him. She wasn't acting alone. "No," I said, watching the panic spark in her eyes. "You just did." She took a step forward, lowering her voice. "Stop this," she hissed, "before someone gets hurt." I felt my breath catch, not from fear, but from clarity. She wasn't threatening me. She was afraid. I lifted my chin. "I won't stop." Her lips tightened into a razor-thin line. "Then you'd better pray the next steps don't happen too fast for you to handle." She turned, walking briskly down the driveway to her car. I stood there long after she drove off, heart pounding, the morning wind cooling the sweat at the base of my neck. Someone gets hurt. Not a threat. A warning. I walked back inside, closed the door, and leaned against it. Brielle's fear wasn't about losing money. It was about losing control. She wasn't the architect of this scheme. She was just the first layer. And now that I knew Calvin's name, now that she knew I knew someone else, would come next. Someone with more power, more reach, more to lose. The real war had begun. I tightened my grip on the folder of documents. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was hunting the truth. I didn't leave the house for the rest of the day. I kept the curtains drawn, the brooch recorder pinned to my sweater, and the folder of documents spread across the dining table like a battlefield map. Every so often, I would catch myself listening, really listening to the silence, wondering if it was truly silence or simply the breath before another intrusion. By evening, I had made up my mind I was going to the police. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Tonight. I gathered everything: printouts, screenshots, photos from Mrs. Drake, copies of Northridge's forged notes, and placed them neatly into a zippered binder. It felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of months of deceit compressed into one object. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it, then headed to the car. As I slid into the driver's seat and buckled in, my phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number, do not go anywhere tonight. For your safety. My breath caught. Before I could respond, another message. You're being watched. I scanned the dark street. A single car sat at the curb across from my house, lights off, windows tinted. It could have been any car belonging to anyone. But after everything that had happened, suspicion clung to me like a second skin. My hands trembled as I started the engine, but I forced myself to breathe, to move, to leave. Another buzz. We can help you if you stop now. Help me. Stop now. The words chilled me. I threw my phone into the passenger seat and drove away, refusing to look back. The police station was 15 minutes away, and each mile felt like pushing through an unseen current. But I made it. The harsh fluorescent lights of the lobby greeted me like a sanctuary. A young officer at the front desk looked up politely. Evening, ma'am. How can I help you? I need to speak to someone about identity theft, I said. And potentially elder exploitation. He straightened immediately. Yes, of course. Let me grab Detective Moreno. A few minutes later, a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes walked toward me. Her hair was pulled back, her posture alert, not tense, but ready. Something in her demeanor made me feel safe. Mrs. Hale, she said. I'm Detective Lena Moreno. Come with me. Her office was small but warm, papers neatly stacked, a coffee mug half full on the desk. She motioned for me to sit. What happened? I opened the binder and laid it in front of her. This is everything I've found so far. Bank fraud, forged medical records, a fraudulent guardianship attempt, and someone named Calvin Rudd involved in all of it. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes flicked sharply at the name. Rudd, she murmured, writing it down. Tell me everything from the beginning. I walked her through the timeline, the payments, the falsified records, Brielle's manipulation, Evan's accidental signature of the power of attorney documents, the strange calls and emails, the SUV that Mrs. Drake photographed, the Northridge connection. Moreno listened without interrupting, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. When I finished, she leaned back slowly. This is more sophisticated than typical elder fraud, she said. Whoever orchestrated this is experienced. And the fact that your medical records were altered, that's not easy. That requires someone with access or someone paying for access. I swallowed. Can you help me? Absolutely, she said. But we need to do this carefully. She pulled a form from her drawer and slid it toward me. I'd like you to file a formal complaint. Once it's on record, we can start a case file, notify financial institutions, and request the clinic's audit logs. I reached for the pen, and then her office door opened without a knock. A tall man stepped inside. Trim suit, slicked back hair, a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Detective Moreno, he said smoothly. Sorry to interrupt. I just saw our guest's name on the lobby register and wanted to check in. Moreno frowned. Detective Hayes, this is my case. Oh, of course, Hayes said, stepping farther into the room. I just wanted to ensure everything is handled appropriately. Mrs. Hale was it? A misunderstanding like this can be distressing at your age. My jaw tightened. Moreno's shoulders straightened. Hayes, you're not assigned to this. But Hayes cut her off. I'd be happy to take over. No need for unnecessary escalations. Moreno's voice sharpened. Hayes, out. He smiled again, thin and practiced. Very well. But I'll keep an eye on this one. He left, closing the door behind him. I exhaled shakily. Who was that? Moreno rubbed her temples. A political climber. He likes to involve himself in cases that might get attention. Ignore him. But her tone betrayed a hint of unease. She lifted the pen again and handed it to me. Let's get this filed. My hand barely touched the paper when a loud knock pounded at the door. Moreno stiffened. Come in. A uniformed officer leaned inside. Detective, there's a call for you. Urgent. She excused herself, leaving the office. I could hear her voice in the hallway, muffled words, rising tension, but not the content. While I waited, I closed the binder and clasped my hands together, trying to calm the tremor in them. Something wasn't right. After a few minutes, Moreno returned, her face pale. "We need to pause," she said. "Your name just came up in a separate inquiry. Someone filed a competency concern earlier today." Ice shot through me. What I whispered. "It was submitted anonymously," she said. "And it claims you're showing signs of cognitive impairment." "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, that's not. This is exactly what they want." "I know," she said firmly, "which is why we need to be methodical." She closed the file gently. "I'm still taking your case, but you need to be careful. If someone is using the system to build a guardianship narrative, they may try to discredit you." I steadied my breath. "Detective, I'm not confused. I'm not losing my memory. This is a setup." "I believe you," she said. "But until I can prove it, you need to protect yourself." "From who?" I whispered. She hesitated. "From anyone who benefits if you're declared incompetent." My heart thudded. Evan Brielle, Calvin, someone else entirely. Moreno walked me out through a side exit to avoid Detective Hayes, who she suspected was watching the hallway. "Go straight home," she instructed, "and keep a record of everything. We'll meet again tomorrow." As I stepped outside, the cold night wrapped around me. The parking lot was dim, the street lamps buzzing faintly. I unlocked my car and climbed in. The air inside was cold. Too cold. A chill crept up the back of my neck. Something was off. My headlights illuminated the police station as I reversed. I checked the rearview mirror and froze. In the parking lot, leaning casually against a black SUV, was a man on his phone. The same build, the same stance, the same car Mrs. Drake had photographed. He lifted his gaze to my mirror, and for the briefest moment our eyes met. A small, knowing smile curved across his face. I didn't wait. I pressed the gas and pulled onto the road, adrenaline hammering through my bloodstream. I didn't know who he was, but I knew what he was telling me. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. I didn't go straight home that night. Some instinct deep primal kept my hands tight on the wheel, and my foot pressed steadily on the gas pedal long after I had passed my neighborhood. The image of the man in the parking lot leaning against the black SUV with that small knowing smile stayed burned into the back of my mind. If I returned home, I would be predictable. Easy to approach, easy to corner. Instead, I drove aimlessly for several minutes, letting my thoughts settle. Streetlights reflected off the windshield, casting ribbons of pale gold across my lap. My breath fogged the inside of the car, but I didn't notice the cold. I noticed only the weight of something closing in around my life. When I finally pulled into a grocery store parking lot, the engine ticking softly after I turned it off, I pulled out my phone and called the one person I trusted without hesitation. "Tessa," she answered on the first ring. "Aunt Marjorie, are you okay?" Her voice alone loosened a knot I hadn't known I was clenching. "I need you to come to my house," I said quietly. "But take the long way. Don't drive directly, and park 2 streets over." There was a beat of silence before she said, "I'll be there in 15 minutes." I waited several minutes before returning home, scanning constantly for the SUV. Nothing followed me. No headlights trailing too close. No silhouettes waiting on the corner. When I finally turned onto my street, everything looked unnervingly normal. Holiday lights glowed from neighbors' windows. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. My house stood exactly as I left it, lights off, curtains still drawn. But the normalcy itself frightened me. Inside, I locked every door and checked every window latch. I pulled the shades down tight. Only after the house felt sealed did I exhale. 15 minutes later, I heard the soft, deliberate pattern of 3 knocks on the back porch door, the signal Tessa and I agreed on years ago after a neighborhood scare. I opened it quickly and ushered her in. She carried a laptop bag, a portable scanner, and her expression a mixture of determination and fear told me she already understood more than she had said over the phone. "Aunt Marjorie," she whispered as she stepped inside. "You look pale." What happened? I told her everything, the man at the station, the messages, the blocked number, and especially the phrase he used for your safety. By the time I finished, she had gone silent, her mind clearly processing at high speed. "Okay," she said finally. "We have to assume your communications are compromised. My phone, my email." "All of it," she said quietly. "If someone's monitoring you digitally, they may also have remote access to your devices." A chill crawled over me. She reached into her bag and placed 3 items on the table: a small portable router, a privacy shield, and a fresh notebook. "Until we know more," she said, "you write anything sensitive on paper. Not your phone, not your laptop, nothing connected to a network." I nodded. "And you do not answer unknown calls," she added. "Not one. Not even if they claim to be from the police." Her emphasis sharpened every word. "What do we do first?" I asked. She sat beside me and opened her laptop. "I pulled something interesting from the browsing history on your bank profile," she said. "A search query, elder guardianship emergency filing." My stomach turned. "I didn't search that." "I know," she said. "Which means the person using your identity was preparing to file a petition." "They might still be preparing it." The air thickened. "If they succeed, they won't," but her voice wavered. Then she pulled up another document, something she hadn't shown me yet. "When you left the police station," she said, "I ran a search on the name Calvin Rudd. The screen filled with articles and legal briefs. He's not just some advisor at Northridge Wellness. He's a contractor, a fixer. He consults for investors, nursing homes, and private clinics." "What does he fix?" I asked. "Whatever he's paid to," she answered. "Usually asset disputes, contested estates, elder competency conflicts." Conflicts. The word shook something inside me. "There's more," she added, voice dropping. 2 families, one in Colorado, one in Illinois, filed complaints against him. Both involved elderly parents suddenly being declared incompetent. Both cases settled quietly. The families withdrew the reports after receiving private resolutions. She clicked another file open. "And he has a relative, possibly a nephew, who works part-time in administrative processing at Northridge." I stared at her. "So they're connected both financially and institutionally," I whispered. "It looks that way." I leaned back, stunned by how wide the web stretched. Why target me? Why now? She stared down at the documents. "Because you're at a point where your assets can be seized quickly if a judge approves a guardianship. And because Brielle gave them an opening." My breath caught. So Brielle was the entry point. "She's been feeding them information for months," Tessa said. "Maybe longer." A wave of nausea washed over me. My son's wife, someone I cooked for celebrated holidays with, had opened the door to predators. I closed my eyes. Jonathan suspected something. He tried to warn me, but you were grieving," she said gently, "and you trusted your family." I opened my eyes again, and the sickness inside hardened into something sharper. Resolve. "Okay," I said slowly. "What's our next move?" Tessa hesitated, then reached into her bag again. "Aunt Marjorie, I found something else." From a padded envelope, she pulled out a USB drive. "I retrieved this from Mom's old files," she said softly. "She saved recordings from when Jonathan was sick." My breath hitched. She said something didn't sit right with her. About the clinic, about the paperwork. She thought someone was altering his files. But she didn't want to scare you. Tears filled my eyes. She continued, "Mom talked to a clinic administrator months before she passed. She saved the conversation because she didn't trust what she was hearing. She plugged the USB drive into her laptop." "Listen." The audio crackled before a woman's voice, my sister's voice, filled the room. "Yes, I'm calling about my brother-in-law's records. There are discrepancies. Dates that don't match, missing signatures. A man's voice answered, polite but clipped. Our system occasionally updates automatically. Nothing to be concerned about. But the notes say he experienced confusion episodes he never had. Again, standard procedural language. And this signature isn't his. A pause. Long. Uncomfortable. That file shouldn't have been altered, the man said finally, his voice dropping. So it was altered. I'm not authorized to discuss this. Tessa stopped the audio. I covered my mouth. Do you hear the fear in his voice? She asked. That wasn't a clerical mistake. That was deliberate. Someone was interfering with Jonathan's medical documentation years ago. My pulse hammered. Years. Not months, not weeks. Years. Whoever did this to you, she whispered, started with him. I didn't breathe for several seconds. Not because of the revelation, but because of what it implied. If Jonathan's decline wasn't as natural as it seemed. If someone was altering his records long before I noticed. If he suspected something more sinister. My blood chilled. Tessa reached across the table and took my hand. Aunt Marjorie, we're dealing with professionals, people who know medical and legal systems, people who are paid to erase the elderly. Erase. The word struck like lightning. I'm going to find everything they hid, Tessa continued. But you must protect yourself. Stay aware, record everything, and do not under any circumstance meet with anyone from the clinic alone. I nodded slowly, but even as she spoke, a new clarity formed inside me. This wasn't just about bank accounts, or forged documents, or Brielle's betrayal. This was about Jonathan, about what he tried to shield me from, about the shadow he saw moving toward us long before I recognized its shape. And if someone thought they could strip away my voice the way they tried to silence his, they had underestimated the wrong woman. By the time Tessa packed her things and left through the back door, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I stood in the center of my quiet house, the silver recorder glimmering faintly under the kitchen light, and whispered into the empty room. I'm not afraid anymore. Because I finally understood they weren't just hunting me. They were afraid of what I might uncover. I woke before dawn the next morning, the house still wrapped in that deep bluish quiet that only comes before sunrise. For a few seconds, I lay still, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the gentle creak of the old oak beams. Ordinary sounds, familiar sounds. But beneath them pulsed a jittery awareness, an instinct that today something would shift. I rose, wrapped myself in a sweater, and went to the kitchen. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I simply filled the kettle and lit the stove, watching the small flame flicker under the metal. Halfway through pouring my tea, I heard a knock. Not the front door. The back porch door. 3 quick taps. A pause. 2 more. A pattern. Not random. Not neighborly. My hand tightened around the mug. I moved softly through the kitchen, each step careful, controlled. I peered through the blinds. Mrs. Drake stood there, bundled in her wool coat, her breath clouding in the cold morning air. Her cane was tucked under her arm, one hand clutching a small envelope. Relief washed over me. I unlocked the door and ushered her inside. What on earth brings you here this early? I whispered. She didn't smile. Not even a flicker. May I sit? She asked. I guided her to the kitchen table. She lowered herself into the chair with a quiet groan, then slid the envelope across to me. I found something, she said. Or rather, I found someone. My heartbeat quickened. Who that man you asked about? The one near your mailbox. Her eyes sharpened. I saw him again yesterday afternoon. My breath caught. Where behind the Northridge Wellness Center, she said. I recognized the car first, the same black SUV. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. She continued. He was speaking with a woman near the loading entrance. Blonde, tall, wearing a clinic badge. My stomach twisted painfully. A clinician or administrator, she said. Hard to tell from a distance, but they seemed Comfortable. Familiar. She paused. He handed her a folder. She opened it and took out what looked like a patient file. I pressed a hand to my chest, grounding myself. Do you think it was mine? Mrs. Drake inhaled slowly. I think it was something they didn't want anyone to see. She nudged the envelope closer. I wrote down everything I could remember, descriptions, the exact time, the license plate again. I opened the envelope. Inside was a meticulously handwritten sheet, her cursive tight but legible. She had included every detail down to the slant of the man's posture and the color of the woman's nail polish. Thank you, I whispered. You don't know how much this means. Oh, I think I do, she said softly. You're not the first older woman they've tried to corner. Her words hit me like a gust of cold wind. What do you mean? I asked. She hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the window as though she were looking at a memory rather than the backyard. My mother, she said quietly, was declared incompetent before she died. It wasn't true. We knew it wasn't true. But there was paperwork all neatly filled out, stamped and confirmed. The signatures were questionable. The timing even more so. But by the time we realized, it was too late. I stared at her, shocked. Mrs. Drake. I'm so sorry. It was decades ago, she murmured. But when I saw that man outside your home, I felt something in my bones. A recognition. Something I never wanted anyone else to feel. She lifted her chin. Especially not you. Warm tears pricked my eyes. I placed my hand over hers. You did the right thing, I said, and I'm grateful. She squeezed my fingers. You need to be careful. These people, whoever they are, they're not impulsive. They're deliberate. They see older women as opportunities. I swallowed the swell of emotion. Not this time. She nodded firmly. Good. After she left, I sat alone for several long minutes, staring at the envelope, her words echoing inside me like a warning bell. You're not the first older woman they've tried to corner. What happened to her mother could have been a blueprint, one perfected over time. I reached for my phone and dialed Detective Moreno. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining what Mrs. Drake saw, requesting a callback, trying to keep my voice steady. Then I called Evan. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. Odd. He always answered me. I tried again. Same result. A small knot formed in my stomach. I made myself tea, but nothing tasted right. After pacing the kitchen twice, I grabbed my jacket and drove to Evan's house. I needed to see him. Needed to hear from him directly. Needed reassurance that he wasn't tangled deeper in this web than I'd realized. His house looked quiet when I pulled up. Too quiet. I knocked, waited, knocked again harder. No answer. I reached for the doorknob and froze. It turned, unlocked. Fear prickled up my spine. Evan never left his door unlocked, not with 2 children in the house. I stepped inside slowly, calling his name. Evan's silence. The living room was immaculate. The toys that usually littered the floor were neatly stored. A faint smell of vanilla candles hung in the air, but beneath it, something else. A faint medicinal scent. I moved toward the kitchen. Evan, I called again. Then I heard a noise, footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate. I stiffened. The brooch recorder warmed against my collarbone. I whispered silently in my mind, let it catch everything. I climbed the steps one at a time until I reached the landing. The door to Evan and Brielle's bedroom was open. I stepped inside. Evan sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, hands covering his face. Relief washed through me. Evan? I breathed. I was worried. He looked up, and the relief vanished. His eyes were red, swollen, haunted. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair unkempt. He looked like someone who had been crying for hours. Mom, he whispered. I'm so sorry. My heart thudded. For what? He rubbed his hands together anxiously. I've been meaning to tell you sooner. I didn't know how. I stepped closer. Tell me what Brielle, he choked out. She's gone. My stomach dropped. What do you mean gone? She packed a bag, took the kids and left last night while I was sleeping. I stumbled backwards slightly. Took the kids without telling you. She left a note, he said. Said she needed space. Said she didn't feel safe with everything going on. Said I was too emotionally unstable to care for them right now. My heart twisted sharply. Evan, that's not true. He squeezed his eyes shut. She said she was going somewhere people understood her concerns. Somewhere she'd be protected. Protected by who? When his eyes met mine again, I saw the answer before he spoke it. Northridge, he whispered. She took them to Northridge. Cold washed over me like a drowning wave. They're involved, he continued, voice breaking. She kept saying she needed to talk to the people who knew what was best, who could help her prepare things. I didn't know what she meant until this morning. Evan, I said, gripping his arms, you need to listen to me very carefully. But before I could continue, the front door slammed downstairs. We both froze. Footsteps echoed upward, heavy, unhurried, purposeful. Evan's breath caught. Oh God, he whispered. He's here. Who? I whispered urgently. Evan, who is here? His voice trembled. Calvin. Calvin's footsteps echoed up the staircase with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though he wanted us to hear every single step. Evan's face drained of color. I'd never seen my son look so frightened, not as a boy, not as a man, not even when he held Jonathan's hand during those last hours. This fear was different, deeper, instinctive. I put a hand on Evan's arm. Get behind me. No, he whispered. Mom, now I said firmly. Something in my tone snapped him out of the paralysis. He stepped back, positioning himself slightly behind my shoulder. I took one step forward, planting my feet, steadying my breath. My pulse hammered against the brooch recorder pinned to my sweater. If this was the moment everything came into the light, then let it be recorded. Calvin appeared at the top of the stairs. Tall, calm, too calm. His suit was immaculate dark gray, pressed so sharply it looked like it could cut. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place. And his expression, that was the strangest part. He didn't look angry or surprised. He looked entertained. As expected, he said smoothly, his gaze landing on me. You came straight to your son. His voice was so casual, so conversational, that it took me a moment to understand the implication. He'd been waiting for me, predicting me, tracking me. How did you get into my home? Evan demanded, but his voice cracked. Calvin's smile widened slightly. You really should change your locks. Brielle shared the code so many times, I'm surprised your whole neighborhood doesn't know it. Evan swore under his breath. Calvin tilted his head, studying me now. Mrs. Hale, we have a few things to discuss. I'm not speaking to you, I said, keeping my voice steady. And you're trespassing? Oh, I doubt that, he said lightly. Your daughter-in-law requested assistance. She expressed concerns about your behavior. And as her contracted advisor, I'm obligated to ensure family safety. Advisor. There was no universe in which this man merely advised. You're not getting near me, I said. Or near my son. Calvin tisked softly. Still so sure of yourself, even now. His eyes fixed on the folder of papers clutched in my hand. Ah, he murmured. So you've started collecting. He took a step toward me. I took a step back. Evan stepped forward again, voice shaking with fury. You need to leave. Calvin flicked his eyes toward him, almost bored. Your wife made the right choice, Evan. You are far too emotional for the decisions that need to be made. Don't talk about her, Evan snapped. A strange glimmer crossed Calvin's expression. You really don't know where she's taken them, do you? Evan went still. She went to Northridge. She told you nothing, Calvin said with quiet finality. She left because it's time to formalize next steps. And you, Evan, are an obstacle. Evan staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. That was when it hit me. Calvin didn't need Evan. Never had. Brielle was easier, more malleable. Evan was only useful until the paperwork was complete. And now, expendable. My chest tightened painfully. You're not taking anything else from this family, I said. He chuckled. Mrs. Hale, you're charming. Truly. But this stopped being about your family long ago. It's about ensuring assets are managed before they're wasted. Wasted, I repeated. On the elderly, he said plainly. People near the end of life shouldn't have control over substantial estates. It leads to instability, poor decisions, vulnerability. My hands shook. You're describing theft. I'm describing stewardship. I couldn't breathe for a moment. He believed this. Completely. He wasn't pretending or manipulating. He had rewritten morality to suit his purpose. Is that what you told Jonathan? I whispered. A flicker there, quick as a blink, crossed his eyes. Ah, he said softly. So you did find something. Tessa's USB drive. My sister's recorded call. The altered notes. You targeted him, I whispered. Even before he got sick, Calvin's expression didn't change. But something in his posture shifted his shoulders. Settling his stance, grounding. Jonathan was resistant, he said. He had opinions, concerns, a tendency to cling to independence that no longer served him. He needed guidance. He needed a doctor, I said sharply. Not you. He needed transition planning, Calvin replied. He wouldn't cooperate. It became inconvenient. My pulse roared in my ears. Inconvenient. He had said my dying husband was inconvenient. Evan lunged forward, but I grabbed his arm, stopping him. Calvin didn't flinch. He seemed almost disappointed. Mrs. Hale, he said calmly, you need to understand. This process is inevitable. We simply streamline it. You can resist for a while, but in the end, the documentation stands. Not if I take you down with it. I lifted my chin. What documentation? He smiled, slow, satisfied. Guardianship recommendation, cognitive risk reports, financial concerns, your own son's signature on durable authority. Everything a judge needs. I tightened my grip on the folder. All falsified. Some embellished, he corrected. Some clarified. You're delusional. He stepped even closer. I am efficient. I backed up until my shoulders brushed the bedroom doorframe. But suddenly from behind, Calvin's footsteps sounded downstairs. Multiple footsteps. He turned slightly, brow raised. Then a familiar voice drifted upward. Mom, Tessa. Her voice, strong and calm, filled the hallway. She was not frightened. She was ready. Then another voice behind hers. Police, identify yourselves. Calvin's expression finally broke. His mask slipped. I didn't hesitate. Upstairs, I shouted. We're upstairs! Heavy footsteps raced upward. Calvin whirled, calculating escape routes, left right down the stairs, too late. Detective Moreno appeared at the landing, one hand on her holstered weapon, two uniformed officers behind her. Mr. Rudd, she said with a voice like steel. Step away from them. Calvin lifted his hands slowly. Detective, this is a misunderstanding. No, she said, stepping closer. This is a crime scene. Her eyes flicked to me. Mrs. Hale, are you all right? Yes, I managed. Now I am. Everything happened quickly after that. Two officers approached Calvin. He didn't resist, but watched me the entire time, his eyes cold and furious. As they cuffed him, he spoke calmly. You're delaying the inevitable, Marjorie. That's all. The system is on my side, man. No, I said quietly, feeling the weight of the recorder warming against my sweater. Not this time. His gaze flicked downward, realizing too late that the entire conversation had been recorded. Moreno glanced at the brooch. Her expression sharpened. That device active? Yes, I said. Excellent, she murmured. We'll need every second of it. They escorted Calvin down the stairs. He didn't struggle. He didn't argue. But as he passed Tessa, he paused. You shouldn't involve yourself in this, he said calmly. It won't end well for you. Tessa met his gaze without blinking. It already has. He was taken out the front door. The house fell silent, thick with the aftershock of danger. Evan sank onto the bed, covering his face. His shoulders shook, not with fear this time, but with relief so profound it looked like pain. Tessa knelt beside him, placing a hand on his back. It's over, she whispered. You're safe. I stood in the doorway, watching my son unravel, realizing how deeply he had been manipulated, how tightly he had been held in Calvin's fist. Detective Moreno stepped beside me. We'll need statements, she said softly. Both of you. I nodded. Of course. Then she added, and Mrs. Hale. He wasn't working alone. My breath caught. We'll get the rest of them, she said. I promise. As she walked away, I looked at Evan. Broken, but beginning to heal. And at Tessa, steady, fierce, my anchor through the storm. For the first time in months, I felt something powerful rise inside me. Not fear, not anger, strength. The kind of strength that comes only when a woman realizes she has been underestimated for far too long. I closed the bedroom door and whispered to myself, they picked the wrong family. I spent that night surrounded by paperwork, recordings, screenshots, and copies of every forged document Calvin had ever touched. The house was quiet, but my mind was not. It churned like a slow-moving storm, gathering strength with each piece of evidence I laid in front of me. Tessa had fallen asleep on the couch hours earlier. Her laptop still open beside her, the blue light reflecting softly across her face. Evan, exhausted from the emotional collapse of the day, had gone home to rest under Detective Moreno's instructions. But I couldn't rest. Not yet. Everything Calvin said echoed through me like a haunting refrain. This process is inevitable. You're delaying the inevitable. You don't understand how deep this goes. I finally understood. It was never about me being weak. It was about them convincing everyone else that I was. As I organized the files into two categories, financial and medical, the clock ticked past 2 in the morning. My hands were steady now, my heartbeat even. Every page I touched felt like a brick in the wall I was finally building between myself and those who wanted to take everything from me. When dawn brushed the edges of the windows, I heard Tessa stir. She blinked awake, stretched, and frowned at the light. You didn't sleep, she said. I didn't need to. She sat upright. We have everything we need for the legal team. No, I said quietly. Not yet. There's one more layer missing. Calvin hinted at something bigger. A structure, a network, a system. And we're going to pull the thread until the whole thing falls apart, she said, voice steady. I smiled at her determination. She reminded me so painfully of her mother. Brave, perceptive, persistent, that I had to look away for a moment just to breathe. At 8 sharp, Detective Moreno arrived with coffee and a look that said she hadn't slept either. Morning, she said. I hope you're ready. Today we start the real fight. I've been ready, I replied, surprising even myself with how true it felt. She spread her files across my dining table. We kept Calvin overnight. He's already requested legal counsel. But before his lawyer arrived this morning, he said something interesting. My pulse quickened. What he asked if you'd given up your appointment. I stiffened. Appointment, Moreno nodded grimly. Your cognitive evaluation at Northridge. A cold ripple ran through me. That was created without my consent. I'm not going. Good, she said. Because if you had gone, you would have walked straight into an institutional trap. The clinic's board has ties to several private guardianship firms. Tessa exhaled sharply. They're funneling clients. Vulnerable clients. Moreno nodded. It's not illegal to recommend guardianship. But falsifying records to justify it? That's a crime. And Calvin just admitted offhandedly that he expected you to show up today. So he was counting on me walking into that building, I whispered. Yes, she said. And he's not the only one who works with Northridge. There's someone inside feeding him information. I thought of the blonde woman Mrs. Drake had seen behind the clinic. The file she opened. The SUV. We need to confront them, I said. Moreno raised an eyebrow. Direct confrontation is risky. So is letting them rewrite my life, I replied. For a moment the detective studied me, really studied me, then nodded. All right, she said. But we're doing it my way. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Attorney Wu, it's Moreno. We're ready. By 10 o'clock, we were walking into Caroline Wu's office, a sleek glass building downtown. Caroline stood waiting for us in the lobby, tall, composed, her suit immaculate. She greeted me warmly, but with an undertone of urgency. Marjorie, she said, shaking my hand, I've reviewed the files you sent. You weren't just targeted. You were profiled. These people categorize seniors into financial tiers. What assets you have, who your beneficiaries are, whether your heirs are strong or weak decision-makers. My stomach twisted. And they judged me vulnerable. Worse, she said. They judged you accessible. She led us into a conference room and shut the door. We're going to build a preemptive legal shield, she explained. Once we file it, no one can declare you incompetent without a multi-step medical review from independent specialists selected by the court, not by Northridge. Good, I said. What else? She slid a stack of documents toward me. An affidavit of mental competency. A declaration of independent living. A freeze on all guardianship petitions filed in the past 60 days. And a whistleblower statement regarding medical record tampering. My breath hitched. That's a lot. Her eyes softened. This is how you win. I signed each form, my hand steady. When we finished, she leaned back. Now we expose them. How, Tessa asked. By giving them exactly what they want, Caroline said. A hush fell across the room. You're going to accept a meeting, she continued. Not at Northridge, somewhere public. Somewhere we can control. My pulse quickened. With who? The insider, she said. Whoever has been altering your records. Silence stretched tight and thin. Moreno crossed her arms. We'll wire you. Discreetly. And we'll be in the next room. And what I asked, do I say? Caroline smiled faintly. You let them talk. People who think they're smarter than you always reveal themselves. I nodded slowly. Fear flickered in my chest, but behind it was something sturdier. Resolve. The meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock at a high-end executive wellness suite downtown Neutral Ground, not the clinic itself. The room looked like a hotel lobby crossed with a spa dim lighting, soft music, expensive faux zen decor. Tessa walked with me to the door, squeezed my hand, and left me with Detective Moreno's team in the adjoining room. The brooch recorder was active. A second recorder was hidden in my sleeve. I sat on the small sofa, hands folded tightly in my lap. At 3:15, the door opened. The blonde woman entered. Tall, immaculate. Clinic badge pinned neatly above her pocket. Mrs. Hale, she said with a cool smile, thank you for agreeing to meet. I want to understand what's happening, I said. Oh, there's nothing alarming, she replied politely. Just a few concerns about your recent behaviors. Family has expressed worry. That's a lie, I said, softly. She blinked, startled. I've seen the falsified notes, I continued. The cognitive warnings. The fabricated confusion episodes, all signed by you. Her smile stiffened. Mrs. Hale, those are standard. And the financial guardian authorization, I interrupted. Her throat bobbed. For a moment, the mask cracked. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be," she whispered. "If you sign the recommendation voluntarily, the process will go smoothly. Your assets will be managed responsibly." "By who?" I asked. "You, Calvin?" Her eyes flashed. "This is bigger than him," she said. "We streamline transition for dozens of seniors, people who don't understand the complexities of their estates, people who waste their final years trying to manage what they can't anymore." I leaned forward. "Who decides what they can't manage?" She paused. "We do." Outside the door, Detective Moreno's faint voice said, "Got it." The blonde woman noticed the change in my expression just seconds too late. Her eyes widened. "You're recording this?" The door burst open. Moreno entered with 2 officers. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, her voice cold. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder exploitation, medical fraud, and identity tampering." The blonde woman bolted for the back door. She didn't get 2 steps. Officers restrained her easily. "You don't understand," she yelled. "This is how the system works. We help people know," I said softly. "You help yourselves." She stopped fighting, stared at me with a mixture of fury and fear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she spat. Moreno looked at her calmly. "Neither do you." They escorted her out. When the door finally closed, I exhaled deep, shaking, overwhelming. Tessa burst in seconds later and wrapped her arms around me. "Aunt Marjorie," she whispered, voice trembling with relief. "You did it?" "No," I said, holding her tightly. "We did it." Moreno smiled faintly as she gathered the evidence devices. This, she said, was only the first domino. I looked at her. "Are you ready for the rest?" she asked. I stood straighter, taller, stronger. I've never been more ready in my life. Courtrooms have a particular kind of silence, the kind that feels too heavy for air, too dense for breath. As I stepped inside that morning, the hush wrapped around me like a cold shawl. Evan walked beside me, shoulders tense, and Tessa followed closely, carrying a binder thicker than any textbook I'd ever seen. Detective Moreno and Caroline Wu were already seated at the front reviewing documents. For a moment, I simply stood there, absorbing the enormity of what was about to happen. Months of fear, weeks of planning. Every insult, every forged file, every scheme, they had led to this room, this day, this reckoning. "Mrs. Hale," Caroline said softly, "we're ready." I nodded, though my pulse thudded in my neck like a drum. Across the aisle, Brielle sat hunched at the defendant's table, her blonde hair limp, her hands twisting in her lap. She looked nothing like the immaculate woman who once whispered poison into my ear at dinner parties. Beside her was a tired-looking public defender who kept flipping through pages, his expression tightening the more he read. But the seat next to her, the one that should have belonged to Calvin, sat empty. He was being held elsewhere under federal custody, and yet his absence felt louder than any presence could have. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Cases were read quickly. Motions, appeals, continuances until the clerk finally announced ours. Case number 24, Wellovan-27. People v. Brielle Carter and affiliated parties. My hands trembled only once before I pressed them flat against my skirt. Caroline stood. "Your Honor, the state will demonstrate a coordinated scheme of elder exploitation, financial fraud, falsification of medical records, and an attempted guardianship takeover targeting Mrs. Marjorie Hale." The judge nodded, her stern gaze cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "You may proceed." Caroline stepped forward, her voice steady, confident. "Your Honor, this is not a case of misunderstanding. This is not a family dispute. What we have here is a deliberate, multi-layered attempt to strip an elderly woman of her autonomy, her finances, and her legal rights. We will present clear evidence, digital financial testimonial, and medical to prove it." She clicked a remote, and the first slide appeared on the screen. A bank ledger. Rows of recurring payments, all 112 of them. Mrs. Hale's funds, Caroline continued, were being funneled into subscriptions, membership services, and purchases she neither authorized nor benefited from. All of them traced back to accounts controlled by or linked to Mrs. Carter. Brielle flinched. The prosecutor then presented the forged Northridge medical notes, the guardianship recommendation drafts, and the audio from the blonde administrator's arrest. But it was the recording from my brooch capturing Calvin, admitting manipulation, admitting intent that landed like a hammer blow. Even the judge's expression shifted subtly, the corners of her mouth tightening. "Let's proceed with witness testimony," she said. Detective Moreno took the stand first. She spoke with polished clarity, explaining the investigation, the forged documents, the digital footprints, the falsified Northridge entries. Then came Tessa. She approached the stand with the poise of someone twice her age, her binder in hand. She explained IP traces, login histories, metadata flags, and a detailed breakdown of how Calvin's network operated. At one point, the judge interrupted her. "You're telling me these medical notes were altered deliberately by an insider?" "Yes, Your Honor," Tessa said. The timestamps prove they were done on days Mrs. Hale never visited the clinic. The judge scribbled something. When Evan's name was called, my heart twisted. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked slowly to the stand. For a moment I feared his voice would break, that guilt would freeze him in place. But he sat, inhaled shakily, and began. "I didn't know," he said, voice raw. "I didn't realize what Brielle was doing. She controlled everything, our finances, our schedules, even who I was allowed to talk to." He swallowed hard. "She told me my mother was struggling, that she needed help, that signing a few papers was the right thing to do." He paused, eyes shining. "I trusted her. I shouldn't have, but I never meant to hurt my mother. I felt tears prick, but I held them back." He continued. "When I found out what she'd done, what they'd done, I tried to fix it. But I was scared. She threatened to take my children. She recorded me during arguments to make me look unstable. I didn't know how to get out." His voice cracked. "But Mom never stopped believing in me. And that's why I'm here, to tell the truth." The courtroom fell into a weighted silence. Even Brielle didn't look at him. When he stepped down, I reached out and took his hand. He gripped it tightly as though afraid I'd let go. The judge glanced at Brielle. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "you may speak before sentencing." Brielle rose unsteadily. Her eyes were swollen, tears streaking her mascara. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. I just wanted security. I didn't have it growing up. I married into it. And then they came to me. They said they could help us. They said your mother wouldn't notice." My breath tightened. "They," the judge repeated. Who is they?" Brielle trembled, but her gaze slowly shifted toward the empty seat where Calvin would have sat. "Him," she whispered. "And others like him. People with money. People who run these clinics, these programs. They told me I'd be taken care of if I cooperated." "And why did you cooperate?" the judge asked. Brielle broke down then. "Because he said if I didn't, they'd do it anyway, and I'd be left with nothing." A murmur rippled through the room. "And your children?" the judge asked. Brielle shook her head violently. "I didn't hurt them. I didn't." Her voice cracked into sobs. "I thought I was protecting their future." Caroline leaned close to me and whispered, "This is what a collapsing conspiracy looks like." Finally, the judge lifted her gavel. "Order. I have heard enough." Silence returned, thick and expectant. Based on the evidence presented, she began, "It is clear this was a coordinated attempt to undermine Mrs. Hale's legal capacity, access her financial assets, and orchestrate fraudulent guardianship." She looked directly at Brielle. "You did not act alone, but you acted knowingly." Brielle sobbed harder. "You are hereby remanded into custody on charges of financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud, identity misuse, and obstruction." Brielle's knees buckled as two bailiffs approached. The sound of her crying followed her out of the courtroom, echoing long after the doors closed. But the judge wasn't finished. As for the clinic personnel implicated, she said their warrants are being executed as we speak. Gasps rippled across the gallery, and the court formally refers Mr. Calvin Rudd to federal authorities for expanded investigation into interstate elder exploitation. My breath hitched. It wasn't just about me, or Jonathan. He had hurt others' families. I would never meet seniors who might never recover. The judge folded her hands. Mrs. Hale, this court acknowledges your competency, your independence, and your resilience. You were targeted unfairly. You deserve justice. My throat tightened, unable to speak. The gavel came down. Court adjourned. People rose from their seats. Voices erupted around us. Reporters whispered. Spectators murmured. But all I saw was my son standing there, with tears in his eyes and new air in his lungs. It's over, he whispered. I shook my head gently. No, sweetheart. It's beginning. Because I knew something he didn't. Calvin wasn't done, and he'd left one final message waiting for me. A bailiff approached, envelope in hand. This was delivered for you, he said. I opened it. One line handwritten, you found the pieces, but not the whole truth. My heart thudded. Meet me. Alone. A location. A time. Tomorrow. I exhaled slowly, the paper trembling in my hand. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The address Calvin chose was an old botanical conservatory on the north edge of the city. A place Jonathan once took me when we were newly married, long before illness or loss or betrayal touched our world. The irony wasn't lost on me. I arrived just after noon, walking down the long concrete path lined with winter bare shrubs. The glass building stood ahead of me, like a quiet relic, its metal frame creaking softly in the cold wind. Inside, the air was warm and faintly humid, carrying the faint scent of soil and overgrown ferns. Footsteps echoed easily in the empty space, and mine sounded too loud as I made my way toward the central atrium. I didn't know whether Calvin would be in handcuffs flanked by officers, or whether he had somehow manipulated yet another loophole in the system. All I knew was that he wanted to see me, alone. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I wanted the final page turned as well. He stood near the koi pond in the center of the atrium, hands clasped in front of him, posture almost serene. No cuffs, no restraints, just a man waiting in the middle of a room full of memories I hadn't walked through in decades. You came, he said softly, as though greeting someone he genuinely expected. Yes, I replied, I need this to end. Calvin studied me, head tilted slightly. Has it not already ended? Your son testified. Your niece is celebrated. The court ruled in your favor. The others have been arrested. I stepped closer. You chose this place. Tell me why. He smiled faintly, almost nostalgically. Your husband loved it. The statement hit me harder than any threat he'd thrown before. How do you know that I demanded? I read his journals, he said simply. They were part of the documents I reviewed years ago. You had no right. I had every right, he interrupted. His estate planning required thorough analysis. You were planning to take everything he left me. He didn't deny it. Instead, he walked to the edge of the pond and watched the lazy movement of orange and white koi beneath the water's surface. Mrs. Hale, he began, people like you, responsible, sentimental, generous, are the easiest to guide. You always assume everyone means well. That's your weakness. No, I said, stepping beside him. It used to be my weakness. Not anymore. He considered the statement with a slight nod. Perhaps. I kept my voice steady. Why did you ask to meet? What do you still want? Calvin's expression changed only slightly. Something resigned, almost human, flickered through it. I wanted you to know, he said slowly, that I didn't choose you as a target. His eyes finally met mine. Jonathan did. The conservatory seemed to tilt beneath me. What? The word trembled out of my mouth. What did you just say? Calvin lifted a hand in a calming gesture. Not consciously, not intentionally, but your husband was worried long before he became sick. He asked for consultations about protecting you, about making sure you wouldn't be financially overwhelmed after he was gone. He trusted the wrong people, and by proxy he handed your name to mine. I shook my head. You're lying. No, he said quietly. He was trying to guard you, and in doing so, he revealed just how much there was to guard. The ache in my chest was too deep to hide. Jonathan would never have wanted this. Of course not, Calvin murmured. But people like him, people who prepare, they rarely see the predators watching from the same table. I steadied myself against a marble railing, drawing breath slowly. You manipulated him, I whispered. Calvin didn't deny that either. He was kinder than he should have been, he said. He believed every professional had integrity. He believed every recommendation was made with care. And when his illness began taking pieces of him, those beliefs became easier to exploit. My hand tightened against the railing. You're the reason he doubted himself, I said. You're the reason those last months felt darker than they should have. Calvin inhaled deeply, as though letting the truth settle. Perhaps. A long silence stretched between us. Only the trickling water from a nearby fountain filled the air. And what now? I asked finally. What is this? A confession? A warning? A courtesy? He answered. I stared at him, stunned by the absurdity of the word. You wanted me to know that, I whispered. That you turned my husband's fear into your opportunity. That you stole his trust and tried to use it to destroy me. He looked into the koi pond again, as though addressing the water instead of me. You are the first in years who has fought back, he said. Most people collapse before it reaches this point. I didn't, I said. No, he admitted. You did not. His gaze lifted clear and unblinking. And that is why I wanted to see you. Because when this is over, and it will be over, you should know you were a worthy opponent. I stepped back, revulsion twisting in my stomach. You're going to prison, I said. For a very long time. He smiled faintly. Perhaps. Or perhaps I know things others fear will surface in trial. Fear is a powerful bargaining chip. You won't escape justice. There are many forms of justice, he replied softly. Some of them never enter a courtroom. His words hung in the warm air like smoke. I didn't come for riddles, I said sharply. You're finished, Calvin, and all your secrets will come out. He studied me thoughtfully. One last thing, Mrs. Hale, he said. Check Jonathan's lockbox, the second compartment. There's something he left that even I couldn't access. My breath froze. What is it? A truth, he said. One I imagine you'll want to read. Before I could respond, 2 federal agents stepped through the entrance doors, their footsteps crisp on the stone. Mr. Rudd, one of them, called. Time to go. Calvin didn't resist. He held my gaze a moment longer. I meant what I said, he told me. You were worth the trouble. As they led him away, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure yet, not peace, but the certainty that I had survived the worst of him. And that Jonathan, in his own way, had left me one final puzzle to uncover. It took me 3 hours to gather the courage to open the lockbox Jonathan kept in the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside the second compartment, the hidden one I never knew existed, was a small envelope sealed with his handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. My Marjorie, if you are reading this, then you discovered what I feared but never admitted aloud. I tried to protect you from men like him. But if he reached you, it means you fought back. And if you're fighting, then I know, absolutely know, you will win. I'm proud of you. More than words can hold. Whatever they took, whatever they tried to break, remember this, you were always stronger than their schemes. Always. Jay. I pressed the page to my chest. For the first time in a long time, I cried not from fear, but from love, from survival, from triumph. Weeks later, the court finalized everything. Calvin pled guilty to avoid a federal trial. Brielle received reduced sentencing in exchange for testimony. The clinic network unraveled like rotted thread, with administrators arrested across the state. And Evan, my son, finally found a version of himself not shaped by fear or manipulation. We rebuilt, slowly, quietly, beautifully. One morning, while trimming my lavender bushes, I felt the sun warm my shoulders, heard my granddaughter laughing inside, and realized I was living freely again, more freely than I had in years. And it struck me revenge wasn't the end of my story. Reclaiming myself was. If you've stayed with me until this moment, I want to thank you. Because stories like mine are not rare. Elder exploitation, manipulation, hidden agendas, they're happening in homes across this country every single day. If my journey reminded you of something you've seen or lived, share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could help someone who hasn't yet found the courage to stand up. And if you'd like to hear more stories where justice wins, where the tables turn, where strength rises, in the most unexpected places, stay with this channel. Subscribe, follow, and keep listening. There are more truths out there waiting to be told. And together, we make sure they're never silenced again.